Welcome to this introduction to Chapter 6, Wage Setting and Unemployment. This presentation is meant as a brief summary and introduction to Chapter 6 so as to prepare for more careful studies of the topics in this Chapter 6 in macroeconomics. So this chapter is about the labor market, wage setting and unemployment. And the underlying question is, why is there always unemployment in a market economy? In the beginning of the chapter, we look at the data, the stocks and the flows in the labor market. And then there's a review of different theories of wage setting and unemployment. The baseline theory here is going to be the so-called efficiency wage theory. And then we discuss search and matching frictions, the role of labor unions and bargaining, and minimum wages. And there's also a review of how unemployment has evolved in different countries and of what the research shows about the determinants of unemployment in this chapter. But we will not cover all those topics here. Before we start, we should note that there are two types of unemployment. The focus in this chapter is on the equilibrium level of unemployment, or you could think of it as the normal rate of unemployment. Economists use the word the natural rate of unemployment for the unemployment that you normally tend to have. Over the business cycle, unemployment may be higher or lower than the natural or normal rate. And we call that deviation cyclical unemployment. So if that is positive, then we have more unemployment than usual. If it's negative, we have less unemployment than normal. But that we come to when we study the short run. So a few words about the data. So the data come from labor force surveys, where you interview a random sample of the population and classify people into different categories. And we will use the letter capital N for the number of people employed. So those are the people who have a job and work at least a little bit. And then we use capital U for the number of unemployed. So unemployed are the people who do not have a job but are actively seeking work. And if we sum those two groups, the employed and the unemployed, then we get what is called the labor force. And we denote that by capital L. So you need to learn that term. The idea is those are the people who are directly available for work. They are either working or looking for work. But of course there's a substantial part of the population which are not part of the labor force, and they are called outside the labor force. And that means people who are not working and not actively looking for work. Can be children, retired people, students. Can also be people who would like to have a job but they have given up actively looking for work, so-called discouraged workers. And then we will use little u for unemployment measured as a share of the labor force. So for example, if 8% of the labor force is unemployed, then we say that little u is 0.08. So this is the basic data about the labor market. But of course people are not constantly employed or unemployed. There is quite a lot of turnover between different states. There are people coming into the labor force, going out of the labor force, people getting jobs, people becoming unemployed. Since the focus here is on unemployment, a key question is what determines the chance to find a job for someone who is looking for work? Well, the answer is quite simple. It depends on how many other people are looking for work and how many jobs become available. So suppose that you have a fraction little s of the employed workers who quit every month for exogenous reasons. Maybe they want to move to another town, or maybe they get fed up with their boss or something. They decide to just quit. And we assume that those who are quitting, they at the same time apply for another job. But they quit independent of whether they get a new job or not. Then one can show that the probability to find a new job for someone who is actively looking for work, the probability to find a job within a month, is approximately S over U plus S, where little s is the fraction who leave the jobs and U plus S are the people applying for jobs, which is the unemployed and those who are leaving their jobs. So immediately we see in this simple model that a higher unemployment rate makes it harder to find a job because unemployment is in the denominator. And a higher S makes it easier to find a job. The simplest way to see that is if you divide by S in the numerator and denominator, you see that the job finding rate is increasing in little s. So the more turnover there is, the easier it is to find a job. And in the book there is more discussion of the magnitudes of these numbers. We will not go into that here. In fact, the turnover is quite different. If you compare, for example, Germany and the US, the turnover is much higher in the US than in Germany. Okay, so that's a simple model of the chance to find a job. We see that it depends on the rate of unemployment. So let us now consider one model of wage setting and unemployment. And this is a model that focuses on wage setting and on the question, why are wages not set so that the labor market clears? And the baseline model that we will use here is a version of the so-called efficiency wage theory. And the idea in that theory is that firms set wages, but although there is unemployment, they don't want to reduce their wages for some reason. And here specifically, we focus on the problem of turnover of workers. We know that there is a lot of turnover of workers, and if a firm sets a relatively low wage, that will lead to high turnover because the workers will feel that they are underpaid and they will look around for better jobs. Furthermore, we assume that turnover is costly for firms. If a worker quits, you have to find a new worker, you have to train a new worker, and there may also be some disruptions in production. So therefore, the idea is that although there is unemployment, the firms may not want to reduce the wages to the point where supply equals demand. So in this model, we assume that the firm decides about the wages and about hiring. And we assume that some employees look for other work. And the number of workers who look for work depends on the firm's wage relative to wages of other firms. So if the firm has a high wage, then the workers are very happy and few of them look for other jobs. If the wage that the firm pays is low relative to the market average, then most of their employees will be looking for another job. And we assume that turnover is costly for the company, as I just said, and this implies that a lower wage will have two effects. On the one hand, if you reduce the wage, you lower the wage cost. Of course, the wage payments to the existing workers will be lower, but it will raise the cost of turnover for the firm. So there is a trade-off and there is some profit maximizing wage that the firm will set. And we illustrate this in this diagram. So on the horizontal axis, we have the wage. On the vertical axis, we have labor costs. And the costs consist now of two components. One is the wage, and the higher the wage you set, the higher is the wage cost, and that is this upward sloping line. But the other component of labor cost is the turnover cost, and that is this downward sloping dashed curve. And the idea here is that if we set a very low wage, say a wage of 3, then there will be very high turnover costs because you need to recruit and train a lot of new workers all the time. On the other hand, if you set a very high wage, say 18, then very few workers will want to leave this good job with a high wage, so you have very low turnover cost. Now, both these, the wage and the turnover cost, are costs for the firm. So if you sum those, you get this curve here. And that is the total labor cost, including the wage and the turnover cost. And then, of course, the firm wants to minimize the total cost per worker, and the wage that minimizes the total cost per worker is around 7. That is where you have the lowest cost per worker. If you have a very low wage, then the wage payments are low, but the turnover costs are very high. If you have a very high wage, well, then you have almost no turnover costs, but your wage costs are very high. So there is some optimal level where you set the wage. What happens then if unemployment drops? Well, that makes it easier for workers to find other jobs. So if I'm employed, I'm not so happy with my wage and I look for other jobs. Of course, if there's low unemployment, it's easier for me to find another job. And that means that turnover costs increase. In terms of the graph, this curve that shows the turnover cost, that will shift up. And the wage that minimizes the total labor cost goes up. So the firm will raise its wage to counteract this increase in staff turnover. So when there's a lot of competition for workers and low unemployment, that will create an upward pressure on the wages. This is all very intuitive. So we have learned that if there's low unemployment, all firms want to raise their wages compared to other firms. And if there's high unemployment, all firms want to reduce their wages relative to other firms. We can then illustrate the equilibrium in the labor market in this diagram. So on the vertical axis, we have the firm's relative wage. So the I is the number of the firm, and WI is the firm's wage, and W is the average wage in the market. That was the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, we have the unemployment rate. And we have just learned from this theory that if unemployment is high, then the firms want to set a lower wage, and we denote the firm's desired or profit maximizing wage by WD. So if unemployment is high, firms want to set a lower wage relative to other firms because turnover is less of a problem. If unemployment is very low, then all firms want to raise their wages in order to reduce turnover. So what is the equilibrium? Well, again, we use the idea that all firms are alike. All firms face the same problem. So in an equilibrium where all firms are symmetric, the relative wage has to be 1. And that requires that the unemployment rate is on this level, UN. So there's one level of unemployment which is such that firms are happy with their wage, that firms don't want to raise their wage or reduce their wage relative to other firms. And that is this level of unemployment. If unemployment is higher, there's downward pressure on the wages. If unemployment is lower, there's upward pressure on the wages. And this gives us a theory of the natural level of unemployment. So this is what we say here. All companies face the same problem. They must set the same wage in equilibrium, and that means that the unemployment rate must be on such a level that no firm wants to change its wage relative to other firms. So here we have now a theory of why there's always some unemployment in the market economy. And the basic idea is that although there is unemployment, firms do not want to reduce their wages because that would lead to too high turnover costs. So you could ask, how does the adjustment to equilibrium take place? Well, if unemployment is below the natural level, then it's optimal for the firms to raise their wages and reduce the number of employees, which means that employment will fall and unemployment will increase. So you adjust towards equilibrium. Similarly, if unemployment is above the natural level, the firms want to lower wages and increase the number of employees, so employment rises. And this way you come to the equilibrium point where no company wants to change its wage relative to the other firms. Now, this short-run dynamics and how wages and unemployment adjust towards the equilibrium level, we will analyze that much more carefully in Chapter 9, which deals with inflation and unemployment. So you can also illustrate this labor market equilibrium in another diagram where you have employment and the real wage. So we have employment on the horizontal axis, the real wage on the vertical axis, and here is the labor force, and here's the marginal product of labor. For a given capital stock, the marginal product of labor decreases with employment. And if we would have perfect competition, we would be at point A, where there's full employment and the workers are paid their marginal product at full employment. But in this model that we have imperfect competition in goods markets and labor markets. And that means that the wage is not going to be the marginal product, but the marginal product divided by 1 plus the markup. And that's a curve here, which is lower than the marginal product. And we have just explained that there will be some unemployment in a long-run equilibrium. So employment is not going to be at full employment, but below that. And how far below? Well, that depends on the wage setting curve that we analyzed before. So if this is the natural level of employment, the real wage is then going to be here, where the workers are paid the marginal product divided by 1 plus the markup, where the marginal product is evaluated at the natural level of employment. So this shows how our model, with imperfections in the product and labor markets, differs from perfect competition. Now, so far we have been reasoning as if all workers were homogeneous and all jobs were homogeneous. We have assumed that all unemployed workers are available and apply for all jobs that become available. But in reality, of course, workers and jobs are far from homogeneous. Workers have their specific qualifications, education, experience, and jobs have their specific requirements that you have to fulfill in order to carry out the jobs. So there's a complicated matching process where the workers and jobs are matched. You need to have the right person for the job, and he or she has to be willing to take that job. And workers do not typically apply for every job that becomes available. They make a choice of what jobs to apply for and what jobs not to apply for. And it takes time for an unemployed person to find a job, and it takes time for a company to find someone to employ. And this matching process, how that works, is also important for the level of unemployment. If this matching process works poorly, then unemployment will be higher. So factors that influence the ability of workers to find jobs are how intensely the unemployed workers are looking for work, how picky they are when it comes to what jobs they want to have. If you only apply for very few jobs, then of course your chance to get a job is lower. And also, of course, important is how well the unemployed can compete for the jobs, whether they have the qualifications needed to actually compete for those jobs that are available. So if unemployment is high, then wages need to fall in order for employment to increase. But if the unemployed are unwilling or unable to compete for the available jobs, then the wages will not be held back. And then the wage setting curve is going to be higher up, and the natural level of unemployment will be higher. We can illustrate that with our little figure here. If you have more search frictions, then the effect of unemployment on wage setting will be weaker, and the wage setting curve will be higher up, and there will be higher unemployment in the equilibrium. The downward pressure on wages from unemployment will be weaker, and that leads to a higher equilibrium rate of unemployment. Another factor that plays a role in some parts of the labor market is labor unions. So workers can form a union, and they can threaten to go on strike if they don't get the wage that they want. And from the macro perspective, the result is higher wages. If workers have bargaining power, they can push up the wages. And we can then go back to this graph again. If workers have bargaining power and they can then push up the wage above the level that the firms would have set, that means that the wage setting curve shifts up, and the result is higher unemployment. So in this simple model, unions are actually creating unemployment. Of course, unions do a lot of other things in reality, for example, protecting individual workers from being badly treated and so on, but that is not part of the macro analysis. And then in some parts of the labor market, minimum wages play a role. And that is discussed a bit in the book. So we see the labor market is heterogeneous, and different parts of the labor market work in different ways. Just to summarize, should we think of the unemployment problem as a problem of supply or demand? Is it that people are unemployed because they don't want to take the jobs that they could get, or is it because there is a lack of jobs? Well, if we think carefully about it, we realize that both supply and demand matter. And it's really a matter of an interaction between supply and demand. Supply matters because people do make choices what jobs to apply for. And with a very generous benefit system, it's likely that people apply for fewer jobs, and that will affect unemployment and wage setting. So you can't have a system where you pay people the same income independent of whether they work or not. There must be incentives on the worker side to apply for those jobs that are available rather than waiting for jobs that are not available. But also demand clearly matters. Firms must be willing to hire, and in a market economy, the firms hire workers only if the marginal revenue product of the worker is higher than the wage. So demand has very much to do with wage setting. If the wages are above the market clearing level, there will be unemployment. And then it doesn't really help that workers are desperate to get jobs. There are just not enough jobs. So, as always in economics, we have to remember that there is supply and demand and both sides matter. Well, the labor market is complicated and there's a lot of heterogeneity, but it seems that some unemployment is unavoidable in a market economy. And some short-term unemployment is not necessarily a big social problem. If workers are unemployed a week or two in a year in the transition between jobs, that's not really a big social problem. But on the other hand, we know that people who are long-term unemployed or repeatedly unemployed, this has very negative effects on their well-being, and it's really a big social problem. So when discussing the unemployment problem, we should also think of what kind of unemployment is it that is problematic from a social point of view. Okay, so in this chapter, we look at data that describes the labor market. We review theories of wage setting and unemployment. We look at unemployment data across countries and time. And there's also some review of what research says on the determinants of unemployment. So good luck with your studies of Chapter 6.